They told me the pain would end after the first modifications. They lied, but not in the way most people understand lying, not with intent to deceive or manipulate, but with the cold, mathematical precision of someone who had removed the capacity for deception, along with most of their organic nervous system. The tech priest who explained this to me, his voice crackling through a Vox grill that had replaced his throat decades ago, simply meant that the pain I felt during the augmentation process would cease once the procedures were complete. What he failed to mention, what he perhaps no longer possessed the human context to understand, was that the pain would be replaced by something far worse than simple physical suffering. The pain would be replaced by absence, by the slow recognition that with each piece of flesh they carved away, each organ they extracted and replaced with blessed machinery, I was losing something that could never be recovered. Something that had no name in the binary cant they were teaching us to speak. Something that the cult mechanicus would dismiss as weakness, inefficiency, the treacherous betrayal of flesh that must be overcome through the blessed union with the machine. I remember my name, though I am not supposed to dwell on such things. Thaddeus. Thaddeus Crane of Forge World Mars, born in the lower isotope sorting facilities where the air itself was thick enough with contamination that most workers died before their 30th year. My parents, may the Emperor preserve their memory, though I doubt he cares about the forgotten millions who labor in Mars foundries. Both succumbed to radiation poisoning by the time I was 12 standard years old. I watched my father's teeth fall out one by one during his final months, watched my mother's hair come away in clumps as the cellular damage accumulated beyond what her unaugmented body could repair. They died as they had lived, as numbers in a production manifest, as acceptable losses in the endless grinding machinery of the Omnissiah's will. I volunteered for the Skitarii legions not out of faith or devotion, though I learned to mouth the proper prayers and benedictions, but out of simple survival instinct. The alternative was to continue working in the sorting facilities until my own body gave out, until I became just another corpse to be rendered down for organic components and sacred oils. The Skitarii offered something different, something that seemed like salvation in my youth and ignorance. They offered augmentation, enhancement, the chance to become something more than the weak and dying flesh that surrounded me. They offered purpose, a place in the great mechanism of the Imperium's defense. They offered, though they did not phrase it this way, the opportunity to trade one kind of death for another, to exchange the slow dissolution of radiation sickness for the faster, cleaner death of the battlefield. Or so I thought, in those days before I understood what the vanguard cohorts truly were. Before I learned that there are fates far worse than either quick death or slow decay. The day of the choosing arrived with the tolling of great bells in the upper manufacture rooms, their sound echoing down through kilometers of industrial architecture until it reached the sorting facilities where we worked. We were given 2 hours to present ourselves for selection, those of us who wished to volunteer, and I remember the crush of bodies as thousands of workers abandoned their stations and rushed toward the designated assembly points. The tech priests descended to meet us, their crimson robes pristine and unstained despite the filth that covered everything in the lower levels, and they moved through our ranks with the mechanical precision of servitors conducting inventory checks. They carried Omnispecs devices, scanning equipment that could penetrate flesh and bone to catalog the suitability of our organs, the integrity of our skeletal structures, the baseline cognitive function that would determine whether we were worth the resources required for augmentation or should be rejected and returned to our previous duties. I stood in line for 6 hours, my legs aching, my stomach empty, watching as tech priest after tech priest moved past me without acknowledgement, their optical sensors flickering across my form and apparently finding me wanting. I began to fear that I would be rejected, that I would return to the sorting facilities and continue my slow death, and this fear was worse than any physical discomfort. Then one stopped before me. his mechadendrites unfurling from beneath his robes like the tentacles of some deep-sea creature from ancient Terran myth, and these metal appendages pressed against my chest, my skull, the base of my spine. Data flowed between the omnispecs and his cortical implants, information streaming too fast for unaugmented perception to follow. And after a moment that stretched into eternity, he marked my designation with a small tattoo burned into my forearm by a laser scalpel. The mark identified me as suitable for the Vanguard cohorts, though I did not know then what this meant. Did not understand that I had just been selected for a fate that some would consider worse than simple rejection. They herded us into transport servitors, great cargo haulers designed to move raw materials rather than human beings, and we rode in darkness and silence as the vehicles climbed up through the levels of the hive to the augmentation facilities. The first cuts began without ceremony, without the rituals and benedictions I'd expected, without anything to mark the moment when Thaddeus Crane ceased to be fully human and began the long transformation into something else. They strapped me to a surgical altar, its surface cold and unyielding against my back, and injected me with chemicals that should have rendered me unconscious, but instead left me in a state of paralysis, unable to move or speak, but fully aware of everything happening to my body. A tech priest explained this was necessary, his voice devoid of sympathy or concern, because they needed my nervous system to remain active during certain procedures to ensure proper integration of the augmetics they would be installing. He told me this the way someone might explain the proper maintenance of a machine, with clinical detachment, and I understood then that to them I was already a machine, or at least a machine in progress, a collection of components that needed to be upgraded and optimized. They started with my legs, cutting through flesh and bone with lace scalpels that cauterized as they cut, filling the air with the smell of burning meat that I recognized from my years in the sorting facilities, the same smell that accompanied industrial accidents and equipment failures. I felt everything, every incision, every moment as they sawed through my femurs and removed my legs from the knees down. The pain was indescribable, not because it was more intense than anything I had experienced, but because it carried with it the knowledge that this was permanent, irreversible, that the legs I had walked on for my entire life were being discarded like defective parts. They replaced them with cybernetic augmentations, sleek metallic limbs that terminated in reinforced foot assemblies designed for the harsh terrain of 1,000 different worlds. The connection points where metal met flesh were agony at first, nerve endings screaming as they were forced to interface with synthetic systems. But the tech priests administered more chemicals, and the agony became something more manageable, a constant background noise that I would learn to ignore. Next came my arms, though they left more of the organic material intact than they had with my legs. They opened the flesh from shoulder to wrist, long, precise cuts that exposed muscle and bone, and they threaded synthetic fibers alongside my natural tendons, installed servo motors at my joints, replaced sections of bone with reinforced alloy struts. My hands remained mostly organic. They told me this was necessary for the proper operation of certain equipment, but they installed receptor nodes in my palms that would allow direct interface with weapons systems and tactical displays. The sensation of having my flesh peeled back while I remained conscious and aware was worse than the cutting, worse than the insertion of foreign objects into my body, because it forced me to see myself as the tech priests saw me, as meat wrapped around a skeleton that needed to be upgraded and enhanced. They worked on my torso next, opening my chest cavity and installing what they called stabilizer implants, metallic frameworks that reinforced my rib cage and provided mounting points for additional augmentations I would receive later. They left my major organs intact at this stage. They said my heart and lungs were still functional and would serve adequately for now, though they installed monitoring systems that would alert them when these organs began to fail and required replacement. My eyes were next, the tech priests approaching with delicate surgical tools and explaining in their grinding mechanical voices that organic eyes were insufficient for the enhanced sensory requirements of a Skitarii warrior. They removed my eyes, not roughly but with the careful precision of someone extracting valuable components, and installed augmetic replacements that connected directly to my optic nerves. The moment of blindness between the removal of my organic eyes and the activation of the augmetic systems was perhaps the most terrifying experience of my life. A darkness so complete that I thought they had made a mistake, that I would spend the rest of my existence trapped in this void. But then the augmetics powered up and I could see again, though what I saw was different from anything I'd experienced before. My vision overlaid with data streams and tactical information that scrolled across my field of view without conscious direction. The most invasive procedures were saved for last, the modifications to my brain and nervous system that would transform me from a human being capable of independent thought and action into a component of a larger system, a soldier designed to function as part of a cohesive unit rather than as an individual. They opened my skull, not completely, but enough to access the surface of my brain, and installed what they called neurosync implants. Small devices that burrowed into my gray matter like metal insects and established connections between my neurons and the command networks of the Skitarii cohorts. The sensation of having something alive, something mechanical but somehow alive, moving inside my head was worse than anything else they had done to me. Worse than the cutting or the burning or the removal of limbs, because it felt like a violation of my very self. An intrusion into the last space that had remained purely mine. The implants connected to regions of my brain that controlled emotion, decision-making, and self-preservation, and they installed override systems that would allow tech priests to suppress or enhance these functions as they saw fit. They also installed what they called psychosurgical modifications, subtle alterations to my neural pathways that would make me more compliant, more focused, less prone to the doubts and hesitations that characterized normal human thought. I could feel these changes taking effect immediately, could feel my emotions becoming muted and distant, could feel my thoughts organizing themselves into more structured patterns, could feel myself becoming less Thaddeus Crane and more something else, something without a proper name in any human language. The final augmentation of this first phase was the installation of vocal modification implants, devices that would allow me to speak in binary cant, the machine language of the cult Mechanicus. They did not remove my ability to speak Gothic. They said this would be retained for communication with baseline humans, but they installed systems that made binary cant feel more natural, more intuitive than the language I'd spoken since childhood. They let me see myself in a reflective surface after the procedures were complete, after they had sealed the incisions and applied regenerative unguents to the areas where flesh met metal, and I barely recognized what looked back at me. The face was similar enough to my own that I could identify features. The basic bone structure remained unchanged, but everything else had been altered or replaced. My eyes glowed with a faint red luminescence from the augmetic replacements. My skin was pale and waxy from the surgical trauma and the weeks I had spent in the augmentation facilities without exposure to natural light. My head had been completely shaved. The tech priests said hair was unnecessary and would only interfere with helmet seals, and I could see the metal ports and connection points that had been installed in my skull. When I tried to speak, to say my name or ask a question, the words came out in binary cant, a stream of ones and zeros that my conscious mind had not intended, but that my modified brain had produced automatically. It took effort, actual physical effort, to force myself to speak in Gothic, and even then my voice sounded wrong, flatter and more mechanical than I remembered. The person in the reflection was a stranger, someone who wore my face but had lost something essential, and I felt a surge of horror at what I had become, but this horror was muted and distant, processed through the psychosurgical modifications that prevented it from overwhelming me or causing me to question my transformation. This was the pattern that would define my existence from that moment forward. Feelings and thoughts that arose naturally but were immediately processed and dampened by the machinery in my skull, leaving me in a state of perpetual emotional detachment, aware that I should feel things more strongly but unable to access those feelings, watching my own reactions as if from a great distance. They issued me the red robes of Mars, heavy fabric designed to protect against both environmental hazards and small arms fire, and these robes became my second skin, covering the modifications that marked me as no longer fully human. The crimson color, they told us in our initial briefing sessions, was symbolic of the toxic rolling deserts of our homeworld, a reminder of the harsh environment that had forged the cult Mechanicus and made them masters of survival in hostile conditions. We were assigned to our maniples, groups of 10 vanguard who would train together, fight together, and quite possibly die together, though the tech priests spoke of death as merely a transition, a return to the sacred oils from which all things in the Omnissiah's service ultimately came. My maniple was designated Theta 7, and I received my own designation, Vanguard Theta 773, a number that would replace my name in all official communications and records. The other members of Theta 7 were in similar states of transformation, some further along than others, all of us marked by the visible signs of our augmentation. We did not speak to each other at first. Communication seemed unnecessary when our neurosync implants allowed us to share tactical data and coordinate movements without words, but gradually we learned to interact in the limited ways that our modifications permitted. There was Theta 769, who had been a foundry worker before his selection, and Theta 771, formerly a maintenance technician on one of the orbital platforms, and 8 others whose previous lives were equally irrelevant to their current function. We trained together for 6 months standard, learning to move as a unit, to process tactical information through our shared network, to respond to commands transmitted directly to our neurosync implants without the delay that verbal orders would require. The Vanguard Alpha who commanded our maniple was a figure of both inspiration and horror. Someone who represented what we would become if we survived long enough, if the radiation and the combat and the endless missions did not kill us first. His designation was Alpha Theta Prime, though he had once possessed a human name that had long since been deleted from all records, and he stood nearly 2 meters tall, despite the fact that very little of his original body remained. His legs were entirely mechanical, advanced models far superior to the basic augmentations we had received, and his arms ended in hands that could transform into weapons or tools as needed. His face was hidden behind a rebreather and optical array that never lifted, and when he spoke, his voice emerged from a vox grill with no trace of human inflection or emotion. He moved with a grace that seemed impossible for something so heavily modified, his cybernetic systems operating with perfect efficiency, and he could process information and issue commands faster than any baseline human could follow. During our training exercises, he would stand motionless for long periods, his optical sensors tracking our movements, his modified brain analyzing our performance with inhuman precision, and then he would transmit corrections directly to our neurosync implants, adjustments to our positioning or tactics that we would implement automatically without conscious thought. It was during these training sessions that we began to understand what we had truly become. Not soldiers in the traditional sense, but components in a larger mechanism, individual units that operated in concert to achieve objectives that were determined by minds far above our level of command. The Alpha told us this explicitly during one briefing, his mechanical voice stating facts without emotion or sentiment. "You are instruments," he said, "precision tools designed for specific functions. Your individual desires, your hopes and fears, your sense of self. These are inefficiencies that have been suppressed so that you can serve more effectively. The Omnissiah requires only your service, not your understanding or agreement. This is the blessed state of the Skitarii, to serve without question, to function without doubt, to fulfill your purpose until the moment when your components fail and you are recycled into new forms of service. It was only after 6 months of training that they introduced us to the weapons that would define our existence, the radium carbines that marked us as vanguard rather than rangers, that distinguished us from other Skitarii cohorts and assigned us our specific role in the endless wars of the Imperium. The tech priests brought these weapons into our training facility with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics, and in a sense that is exactly what they were. Ancient designs that dated back to the early days of Mars's colonization, weapons that had been refined and perfected over 10,000 years of continuous warfare. The radium carbines were beautiful in the way that perfectly engineered machines are beautiful, their Baroque designs covered in sacred inscriptions and purity seals, their mechanisms visible through transparent housings that allowed us to see the blessed technology at work. Each carbine was unique, individually crafted by master artisans who had spent decades learning the proper rituals and techniques, and each bore the mark of the forge world where it had been created. They issued mine during a ceremony that involved extensive benedictions and prayers, tech priests anointing the weapon with sacred oils and chanting in binary cant before placing it in my augmented hands. The weight felt right somehow, perfectly balanced for my modified physiology, and when I raised it to firing position, my augmetic eyes automatically interfaced with the weapon's targeting systems, overlaying my vision with firing solutions and ammunition counts. The tech priest who had presided over the ceremony explained what made these weapons special, what made them simultaneously more deadly than standard las weapons and infinitely more dangerous to their wielders. Radium, he told us in his grinding mechanical voice, is one of the blessed elements, a gift from the Omnissiah that allows his servants to strike down enemies with the very essence of decay and dissolution. The radium carbine does not merely wound its targets through kinetic energy or thermal damage, though it does both of these things with lethal efficiency. No, it wounds through corruption, through contamination, through the introduction of radioactive isotopes that continue to damage organic tissue long after the initial impact. A target struck by even a single round from a radium carbine, provided it survives the immediate trauma, will begin to experience cellular breakdown within minutes, their organs failing, their flesh necrotizing, their very molecular structure coming apart as the radiation does its blessed work. This makes the radium carbine ideal for use against enemies with enhanced healing abilities, against tyrannid bioforms that can regenerate from wounds that would kill normal creatures, against orc physiology that allows them to survive catastrophic damage, against any foe whose resilience might allow them to continue fighting after being shot. The radiation ensures that even if the bullet itself does not kill, the contamination will. But there is a price for this effectiveness, the tech priest continued, his voice carrying what might have been regret if he still possessed the capacity for such emotions. The radiation that makes these weapons so deadly to our enemies does not distinguish between hostile and friendly organic tissue. The carbines are designed with extensive shielding and containment systems, but these systems are not perfect. Radiation leaks from the weapon during operation, slowly contaminating everything in proximity. The ammunition itself is so heavily irradiated that handling it for extended periods causes cellular damage. The act of firing the weapon releases clouds of radioactive particles into the air, particles that are then inhaled and absorbed by anyone nearby. He paused, servos whirring as he adjusted his position, and his optical sensors focused on each of us in turn. You have been selected for the Vanguard cohorts, because your augmentations provide some protection against this radiation, because your modified physiology can withstand exposure that would kill baseline humans within hours. But understand this, the protection is not complete. You will absorb radiation every day you carry these weapons. You will accumulate damage that even your enhanced systems cannot fully repair. You will, slowly and inevitably, be killed by the very tools that make you effective warriors. The training with our radium carbines began immediately after the ceremony, and it was during these exercises that we began to understand the true nature of our service, the specific fate that awaited all Vanguard who survived long enough. They led us to a sealed firing range, its walls reinforced with layers of lead and blessed ceramite to contain the radiation we would generate. And they provided us with servitor targets, mindless organic automatons that would serve as subjects for our weapons testing. The first time I fired my radium carbine, I felt the weapon kick against my shoulder with surprising force, saw the round strike the servitor target and punch through its chest, watched as a faint green glow began to emanate from the wound. The servitor continued functioning for several seconds after being hit, its simple programming not recognizing the damage as immediately fatal, but then it stumbled and fell as its modified nervous system began to shut down under the assault of radiation poisoning. The other targets followed quickly, some from direct hits, others from proximity to the areas where multiple rounds had contaminated the atmosphere. Within 5 minutes of continuous fire, the entire range was saturated with radioactive particles, the air itself becoming a weapon that affected anything organic that breathed it. We stood in this contaminated zone, our rebreathers filtering out the worst of the particles, our augmented systems processing and attempting to repair the damage as it occurred, and we were unaffected. Not because we were immune, but because our modifications allowed us to endure what would kill normal humans. The tech priests monitoring the exercise transmitted data to our neurosync implants, showing the radiation levels in the range, showing the rate at which we were accumulating exposure, showing the predicted timeline before we would require treatment to prevent critical system failures. The numbers were sobering even to our emotionally dampened minds. Based on the radiation levels we had generated during a simple firing exercise, extended combat operations would expose us to doses that would, over time, overwhelm even our augmented physiology. They explained the mechanisms of our radiation resistance during a technical briefing that followed the weapons training. Each Vanguard, we learned, had been fitted with pack generators, compact devices mounted on our backs beneath our robes that provided power for our various augmentations and also, critically, leaked potent radioactive byproducts as part of their normal operation. These generators turned us into walking radiation sources, contaminating everything around us, but also, paradoxically, conditioning our bodies to better tolerate the radiation from our weapons. It was a closed loop of contamination and adaptation, our own radioactivity making us somewhat immune to external sources, even as it slowly destroyed us from within. The tech priests had also made modifications to our cellular structure at the genetic level, installing repair mechanisms that could patch some of the damage caused by radiation exposure, but these mechanisms were limited in their capacity and would become overwhelmed during extended operations. We would need regular treatments in rad cleanser chambers, they told us, facilities that could purge the accumulated radiation from our systems and allow our augmented bodies to continue functioning, but even these treatments had limits. Each cleansing caused its own damage, stripping away contaminated tissue and forcing our bodies to regenerate, and after enough cycles, our flesh would simply stop being able to recover. They showed us veteran Vanguard as examples, warriors who had survived for years in service, and these veterans were barely recognizable as having once been human. Their skin was translucent in places, showing the metal frameworks that had replaced their bones. Their flesh was covered in radiation burns that never fully healed, angry red marks that seeped clear fluid continuously. Some had lost so much organic material that they were more machine than flesh, their bodies held together by cybernetic replacements and sacred unguents, and yet they continued to serve, continued to carry their radium carbines and march into the most hostile environments the galaxy could produce. The tech priests called them omniscient martyrs, blessed servants who had sacrificed their flesh in service to the machine god, and they spoke with reverence about these veterans' dedication and devotion. What they did not say, what we could see clearly despite our emotionally dampened states, was that these veterans were dying slowly, that each day of service brought them closer to total system failure, that they were being consumed by their own weapons and their own devotion. The physical deterioration began almost immediately after we received our radium carbines and began regular training with live ammunition. Within 2 weeks, I noticed my gums bleeding when I tried to eat the nutrient paste that served as our primary food source. Within a month, my hair, which had begun growing back after the initial shaving, started falling out again, this time not from medical procedures, but from radiation damage to the follicles. Within 2 months, I developed lesions on my arms and legs, sores that would not heal despite the regenerative capabilities supposedly built into my augmented physiology. The other members of Theta 7 experienced similar symptoms, each of us deteriorating at slightly different rates depending on our individual tolerance levels and the specific augmentations we had received. Theta 769 lost all his teeth by the 3rd month, his jaw becoming a metal framework with artificial replacements that clicked and ground whenever he tried to speak in Gothic. Theta 771 developed cataracts in his remaining organic eye, the lens clouding over despite regular treatments, and eventually had to receive additional augmetic replacements. Theta 775 began coughing blood during equipment maintenance, his lungs apparently failing faster than the tech priests had predicted, and they had to perform emergency surgery to install respiratory augmetics. We reported these symptoms during our regular medical examinations, and the tech priests recorded the data with clinical detachment, their only concern being whether we remained functional for combat operations. They explained that the deterioration was within expected parameters, that we were experiencing exactly the progression that the radium carbine's operational profile predicted, that we would be cycled through rad cleanser chambers when our contamination levels reached critical thresholds. In the meantime, we should focus on our training and preparation, they told us, because worrying about the inevitable was an inefficiency that served no purpose. The first time they sent me to the rad cleanser chamber was 6 months after I received my radium carbine, after my radiation levels had reached a point where continued exposure would cause irreversible organ damage. The chamber itself was a large metal cylinder, its interior lined with systems whose function I could only guess at, covered in warning symbols and purity seals that marked it as both sacred and dangerous. They stripped me of my armor and robes, removed any augmetics that could be safely disconnected, and sealed me inside with only a rebreather to provide filtered air. The cleansing process began with a flood of chemicals, corrosive solutions designed to strip away contaminated tissue and neutralize radioactive isotopes, and the pain was immediate and overwhelming. Worse than anything I'd experienced during my initial augmentation, because this time I was fully conscious and aware with no paralytic chemicals to dull the sensation. My skin began to slough off in sheets, dissolving under the chemical assault, and I watched through my augmetic eyes as layers of flesh simply separated from my body and floated away in the churning liquid that filled the chamber. The exposed tissue beneath was raw and bleeding, nerve endings screaming signals that my modified brain could not completely suppress, and I understood then why the tech priests had described this as necessary treatment rather than therapy. This was not healing, this was destruction followed by forced regeneration, controlled dismantling of my body followed by mechanical reconstruction. After the chemical phase came thermal treatment, the chamber heating to temperatures that would have killed baseline humans instantly, and this heat burned away the remaining contaminated tissue and stimulated my augmented cellular repair mechanisms to begin regenerating new flesh. The regeneration was neither complete nor perfect. The new skin that grew over my wounds was thinner and weaker than what it replaced, and in places where the damage had been too severe, my body simply filled the gaps with scar tissue or failed to regenerate at all, leaving patches of bare metal framework visible through translucent skin. The entire process took 8 hours, and when they finally opened the chamber and allowed me to emerge, I barely recognized my own body, my reflection showing someone who looked like they had been skinned and partially reassembled. The tech priests assured me this was normal, that my body would continue to adapt and regenerate over the following weeks, that I would return to operational status with acceptable parameters. They did not address the fact that acceptable parameters now meant something very different from what I had understood as healthy, that my baseline condition had shifted to accommodate permanent damage and continuing deterioration. The members of Theta 7 who underwent rad cleansing around the same time emerged from their chambers in similar states, their bodies bearing the marks of the violent purging they had experienced, and for a brief moment we looked at each other with something approaching horror before our psychosurgical modifications reasserted control and dampened the emotional response. We were issued new robes to cover the worst of the visible damage, and we returned to our training schedule as if nothing significant had occurred, though we all moved more carefully for weeks afterward, our regenerated tissue still tender and prone to tearing under stress. The tech priests informed us that we would require rad cleansing every 6 to 8 months, depending on our exposure levels, and that each successive treatment would be somewhat less effective as our body's regenerative capacity declined. They projected that most Vanguard could undergo approximately 10 to 15 cleansing cycles before their flesh could no longer recover adequately, at which point they would either die from accumulated radiation damage or survive through extensive cybernetic replacement of their remaining organic components. Those who survived through augmentation would have passed what they called the crux mechanicus, the point at which a Skitarii's body became more machine than flesh, and these individuals would be promoted to alpha status, given command positions and enhanced augmentations that would extend their service life for years or even decades. This was presented as an achievement to aspire to, a goal that demonstrated dedication and resilience. But looking at the Alpha, who commanded our maniple, I could not help but wonder if survival in that form was truly preferable to simply dying and being recycled. Our first deployment came 9 months after I had joined the Vanguard cohorts, after we had completed our training and demonstrated acceptable proficiency with our weapons and tactics. The tech priests gathered all of Theta 7 in a briefing chamber and transmitted mission parameters directly to our neurosync implants, flooding our consciousness with tactical data, planetary information, enemy force composition, and deployment protocols. The planet was designated Vordrax Prime, a death world in the eastern fringe that was being consumed by Hive Fleet Leviathan, one of the massive Tyranid swarms that had been pushing into Imperial space for decades. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintained research facilities on Vordrax Prime, installations that held valuable data and sacred technologies that could not be allowed to fall into Xenos' hands, and we were part of a larger Skitarii force being deployed to hold these facilities long enough to evacuate the most critical materials and personnel. The planet itself was hostile even before the Tyranid invasion, its atmosphere thick with toxic compounds, its surface covered in acidic jungles where every form of life competed in brutal ecosystems, its weather patterns generating storms that could shred unprotected flesh within minutes. It was exactly the kind of environment where Vanguard cohorts excelled, where our radiation weapons and enhanced durability gave us advantages that normal Imperial Guard forces could not match, where the very toxicity that surrounded us became another weapon to wield against our enemies. The deployment would last approximately 3 months standard, the tech priests estimated, though they noted that casualty rates among Vanguard forces on Death Worlds averaged 70%, meaning that 7 out of every 10 of us could expect to die or suffer injuries severe enough to require extensive cybernetic reconstruction. They loaded us into dropships on the Arch Mechanicus Omnissiah's Fist, a massive vessel that served as both transport and mobile forge for the cult Mechanicus, and these dropships carried us down through Vordrax Prime's turbulent atmosphere to a landing zone that had been cleared by orbital bombardment. The descent was violent, the ship shaking and rattling as it pushed through storm systems and fought against winds that threatened to tear it apart. And through the viewports, I could see the surface of the planet approaching, a nightmare landscape of twisted vegetation and toxic swamps lit by the dull red glow of the planet's dying star. We touched down in what had once been a clearing but was already being reclaimed by the jungle, alien plants pushing up through the scorched earth. And the moment the boarding ramp lowered, I could smell the atmosphere even through my rebreather, a thick mixture of decay and chemical contamination that made Vordrax Prime's air barely breathable even for augmented warriors like us. The heat was oppressive despite our environmental adaptation, and the humidity made our robes cling to our bodies, but we formed up in perfect order and began our march toward the research facility we had been assigned to defend. The jungle around us was filled with sounds, chittering and howling and rustling that might have been native wildlife, or might have been the tyrannid bioforms that had already spread across much of the planet, and our augmetic senses strained to distinguish threats from background noise in this alien environment. We encountered our first tyrannid swarm 3 kilometers from the landing zone, a wave of hormagaunts that burst from the jungle without warning, their scythe-like talons dripping with venom, their alien faces dominated by rows of razor teeth. They moved with horrifying speed, bounding across broken ground faster than any baseline human could run, and they numbered in the hundreds, a living tide of chitin and hunger that seemed unstoppable. Our Vanguard Alpha transmitted firing coordinates to our neurosync implants, and we raised our radium carbines in perfect synchronization, our augmetic eyes calculating range and trajectory automatically, and we opened fire. The Baroque beauty of our weapons was never more apparent than in that moment, their mechanisms visible through transparent housings as we unleashed volleys of hyper-irradiated ammunition into the charging swarm. The rounds struck with devastating effect, punching through chitin armor and tearing into alien flesh. But more impressively, they began to fill the air with radioactive particles, creating a visible green haze that spread outward from our position. The hormagaunts that survived the initial volley, those whose enhanced biology allowed them to regenerate from wounds that would kill other creatures, began to stumble and fall as the radiation poisoning took effect, their rapid healing overwhelmed by cellular corruption that spread faster than their bodies could adapt. Some collapsed mid-leap, their legs giving out as their nervous systems shut down under the assault of accumulated radiation. Others made it to within meters of our position before the contamination reached critical levels, and they fell thrashing and convulsing, their mouths frothing with toxic foam, their eyes clouding as organs failed en masse. We stood in the center of our self-created exclusion zone, surrounded by dying Xenos who had survived our bullets but could not survive our proximity, and we looked on in what the mission briefings had described as silent interest. That peculiar state of detached observation that came so naturally to us now. Our psychosurgical modifications prevented us from feeling satisfaction or horror at the carnage we had created, from experiencing anything more than clinical recognition that our weapons were performing according to design specifications. But somewhere in the deepest recesses of my consciousness, in that small space that still remembered being Thaddeus Crane, I felt something that might have been revulsion at what I had become. Not at killing Xenos. They were enemies of humanity, and their destruction was necessary and justified, but at the manner of their death, at the way we had turned the very air into poison. at the realization that we were weapons as much as the carbines we carried, that our mere presence could create zones of death that would persist long after we had moved on. The ground where the Hormagaunts had fallen was already beginning to show signs of contamination, the alien vegetation withering and turning black, the soil itself taking on a faint luminescence that marked it as radioactive. This patch of jungle would remain deadly for decades, perhaps centuries, a permanent scar on the planet's surface where nothing would grow and nothing could live, and we had created it in less than 10 minutes of combat. We continued our march, leaving the contaminated zone behind, and I wondered how many such zones we would create before this deployment ended, how much of Vordrax Prime would become wasteland because of our passage. The siege of the research facility began 2 days after our arrival. As Tyranid swarms probed our defenses and tested our response times, and it would continue for the next 3 months with varying intensity as the hive mind attempted to overwhelm our position through sheer numerical superiority. The facility itself was a sprawling complex of reinforced structures built to withstand Vordrax Prime's hostile environment. Its walls thick ceramite designed to resist both acid rain and the claws of the planet's native megafauna. But the Tyranids were more persistent and creative than any natural predator. They attacked from multiple angles simultaneously, forcing us to spread our defenses thin, and they adapted to our tactics with horrifying speed, each wave learning from the failures of the previous assault. Our role as vanguard was to hold the most vulnerable approaches, the areas where close quarters combat was most likely, where our radiation-saturated presence would be most effective at creating kill zones that even the Tyranids' adaptive biology could not overcome. We fought day after day, week after week, our radium carbines growing hot from continuous use, our bodies accumulating radiation exposure that would have killed baseline humans 100 times over, and slowly, incrementally, we began to notice the changes that long-term combat operations caused in us. Theta 769's skin began to turn translucent after 6 weeks of combat, the flesh on his arms and face becoming so thin that we could see the metal framework of his augmetics through it, could see the synthetic blood vessels and the pistons that had replaced his muscles. Theta 771 started having seizures during combat, his modified brain apparently struggling to process the overwhelming amount of tactical data while simultaneously managing the increasing radiation load in his system, and the tech priests had to install additional cogitators in his skull to handle the processing burden. Theta 775, who had already received respiratory augmetics months earlier, began coughing up black phlegm during rest periods, a sign that his remaining lung tissue was necrotizing despite the artificial systems that supplemented his breathing. My own deterioration was equally severe, but manifested differently, my extremities developing a numbness that suggested nerve damage from accumulated radiation, my vision experiencing periodic blackouts as my augmetic eyes struggled to compensate for degradation in my optic nerves. We reported these symptoms during regular medical checks, and the tech priests recorded the data with the same clinical detachment they had shown during training, their only intervention being to increase our dosages of various chemical treatments that might slow but could not stop the progressive failure of our organic systems. They told us we were performing within acceptable parameters, that our combat effectiveness had not declined significantly despite our physical deterioration, that we would be evacuated for rad cleansing once the mission parameters had been satisfied, and the research facility's contents had been successfully extracted. The final assault on the research facility came on day 87 of our deployment, when the Tyranid hive mind apparently decided that overwhelming force was necessary to break through our defenses and consume the biomass and technology within. They attacked in numbers that defied rational calculation, thousands upon thousands of bioforms surging toward our position in waves that seemed endless, hormagaunts and termagants, and larger warrior forms, all driven by the singular hunger that defined their species. Our Vanguard Alpha coordinated our response through the NeuroSync network, positioning us at key defensive points and directing our fire with inhuman precision. And we transformed the approaches to the facility into zones of death where nothing organic could survive for more than moments. The concentration of radiation from 60 Vanguard firing simultaneously was unlike anything I had experienced during training or previous combat operations. The air itself taking on a visible glow, a green haze so thick it was almost liquid, and the Tyranids died in droves, not from our bullets, though those were devastating enough, but from simply entering this contaminated zone. The larger warrior forms, those whose enhanced biology should have allowed them to withstand tremendous damage and continue fighting, stumbled and collapsed as their cellular structure broke down under the assault of radiation more intense than the heart of a reactor core. Even the hive mind's legendary adaptability could not save them, could not evolve fast enough to counter the fundamental molecular destruction that radiation caused. And after 6 hours of continuous assault, the Tyranid swarms finally withdrew, leaving behind mountains of corpses that would contaminate the area for millennia. The victory came at a cost that the tech priests quantified with characteristic precision during their post-battle assessment. Of the 60 Vanguard who had begun the final assault, 23 survived to the end of combat operations, and of those 23, only 12 were deemed capable of returning to active duty after rad cleansing and medical intervention. The others, myself included, had accumulated radiation exposure beyond what the cleansing chambers could safely purge, their organic systems damaged beyond the point where regeneration was possible, and we faced a choice that was not really a choice at all. We could accept extensive cybernetic augmentation, replacing our failing flesh with blessed machinery and passing through the crux mechanicus to become something more than human but also less than alive. Or we could refuse augmentation and accept death, our bodies recycled for whatever organic components remained viable and our designations reassigned to new recruits. The psychosurgical modifications that controlled our emotions made this decision easier than it would have been for baseline humans, reducing what should have been an existential crisis to a simple cost-benefit analysis conducted by our augmented brains. Continued service as heavily augmented alphas offered the possibility of years or decades of additional function, while death offered only an end to service that would waste the resources already invested in our training and enhancement. The logical choice was obvious, and one by one we accepted the recommendation for augmentation, though somewhere in that diminishing core of self that still remembered being human, I felt something that might have been mourning for the person I had once been. They transported us back to the Arc Mechanicus for the augmentation procedures, loading our damaged bodies into medical suspension pods that kept our vital functions stable during the journey back to orbit. I spent that time in a state of chemically induced semi-consciousness, my modified brain processing mission data and combat reports, even as my body continued its progressive shutdown. And I found myself reviewing memories that the psychosurgical modifications had supposedly suppressed, but that surfaced now in the quiet moments before transformation. I remembered Thaddeus Crane, remembered his parents dying in the sorting facilities, remembered his fear and desperation as he volunteered for the Skitarii, remembered his hope that augmentation would save him from the slow death that claimed all workers in Mars's lower levels. I wanted to tell him that he had been wrong, that he had traded one kind of death for another, that the salvation he sought had come at the cost of everything that made him human, but I no longer possessed the emotional capacity for such communication, even if it had been possible to speak across time to that younger version of myself. The memories faded as the medical systems adjusted my chemical balance, and when I next achieved full consciousness, I was in an augmentation theater, surrounded by tech priests who were already beginning the process of transforming me into something new. The augmentation procedures that followed my evacuation from Vordrak's Prime were far more extensive than anything I'd experienced during my initial transformation into a vanguard. This time, they did not simply modify and enhance. They replaced, systematically removing every organic component that showed signs of radiation damage and substituting blessed machinery in its place. My legs, which had been cybernetic from the knees down, were completely replaced with advanced servo motor assemblies that connected directly to my spine through reinforced mounting points. My arms received similar treatment, the tech priests stripping away flesh and bone and installing articulated metal frameworks covered in protective plating etched with prayers to the Omnissiah. My torso, which had already contained significant augmentation from my time as a standard vanguard, was opened and rebuilt around an internal chassis of titanium and blessed steel. My remaining organs either removed and replaced with synthetic equivalents or augmented with support systems that would keep them functional despite continued radiation exposure. My face, which had retained some semblance of human features despite months of radiation damage, was reconstructed, the tech priests installing a metal skull framework that supported synthetic skin and more advanced augmetic eyes that interfaced directly with tactical networks and could process information across multiple spectrums simultaneously. When they showed me my reflection after the procedures were complete, after weeks of surgery and modification, I barely recognized what looked back as having any connection to humanity. I had become a machine that wore skin like a disguise, a collection of blessed technologies assembled in approximately human form. And while my augmented brain processed this transformation as necessary and beneficial, that small remaining fragment of Thaddeus Crane felt something that my psychosurgical modifications could no longer fully suppress, a horror at what I had lost and what I had become. The promotion to Vanguard Alpha came with the completion of my augmentation, the tech priests designating me Alpha Theta 773 and assigning me enhanced command privileges within the Skitarii tactical network. My neurosync implants received upgrades that allowed me to coordinate entire mana pools, rather than simply operating as part of one, and they installed what they called an enhanced data tether, a direct connection to tech priest command that made me, in their words, a mouthpiece of the machine god himself. Commands transmitted through this data tether carried holy authority, they told me, and other Skitarii I would obey without question or hesitation, because they would recognize my words as originating from sources far above my actual rank. This authority came with responsibility, they explained. I would be expected to lead from the front, to demonstrate the resilience and dedication that defined veteran Vanguard, to serve as an example that newer recruits could aspire to emulate. They issued me new equipment appropriate to my rank, an arc maul for close combat that could channel electrical energy through targets and overload their nervous systems, a radium pistol that served as a more compact radiation weapon for situations where the carbine would be impractical, and additional armor plating that provided marginally better protection against the radiation I would continue to accumulate. The other Vanguard who had survived with me received similar promotions and augmentations, and we formed a new command structure for the Skitarii cohorts being assembled for the next deployment. But when I looked at these veterans, these heavily augmented warriors who had passed through the Crux Mechanicus and survived to serve again, I could not see them as the same individuals who had been part of Theta 7. We had been transformed so completely that our previous identities were meaningless. We were new beings constructed from the fragments of who we had once been, and the continuity of consciousness that connected us to our former selves was so thin and attenuated that it barely qualified as the same existence. My first assignment as Vanguard Alpha was to lead a maniple of new recruits, 10 freshly augmented warriors designated Delta 3 who had just completed their training and were being prepared for their first combat deployment. They gathered in the briefing chamber where I had received my own initial instructions years ago, though time had become difficult to track. precisely with the combination of mission deployments and medical procedures and the way my augmented brain processed temporal information. They looked at me with augmetic eyes that still retained some capacity for emotion, fear and hope mixing in expressions that I could recognize, even if I could no longer fully experience such feelings myself. And I understood that to them I represented both their future and their fate, the inevitable endpoint of the path they had begun when they volunteered for the Vanguard cohorts. I transmitted mission parameters to their neurosync implants, flooding their consciousness with the tactical data they would need to survive their first deployment. And I watched as their faces showed the strain of processing so much information simultaneously, their recently modified brains struggling with loads that had become routine for me. One of them, designated Vanguard Delta 305, managed to formulate a question despite the overwhelming flow of data, his voice emerging from his Vox grill with a clarity that suggested his vocal modifications were still new enough that he could speak Gothic without effort. "Alpha," he asked, "how long do we have?" His question was ambiguous, deliberately so because asking directly about life expectancy or time until radiation death might be interpreted as doubt in the righteousness of our service. But I understood what he truly wanted to know. I considered several responses, calculated probabilities and statistical models that predicted survival rates based on deployment frequency and radiation exposure patterns. And then I transmitted back a simple statement that encompassed everything he needed to understand. "Until transcendence or dissolution," I told him. "Both are service." I saw the fear in his augmetic eyes intensify briefly before his psychosurgical modifications reasserted control and dampened the emotional response. And I felt nothing watching this happen, no empathy or sympathy or shared understanding, just clinical recognition that his modifications were functioning correctly and that he would adapt to his new existence as we all had. The training exercises I conducted with Delta 3 focused on the specific capabilities that made Vanguard effective in combat situations, particularly our ability to weaponize the radiation that slowly killed us. I taught them to embrace their contamination, to understand that they were not just soldiers carrying weapons, but were themselves weapons, walking sources of lethal radiation that could create exclusion zones where enemies could not survive. We practiced creating raid storms, areas of concentrated radioactive contamination produced by concentrated fire from multiple radium carbines, and I showed them how to position themselves to maximize the coverage of these deadly zones while minimizing exposure to friendly forces. They learned quickly, their augmented brains processing tactical information with increasing efficiency. And within weeks, they could coordinate their movements and fire patterns with the precision that characterized veteran Skitarii cohorts. But I also noticed things about them that I no longer experienced in myself, small signs of remaining humanity that my own extensive augmentation had erased. They still spoke to each other during rest periods, not just transmitting tactical data through neurosync, but engaging in actual conversations in Gothic, sharing thoughts and observations that served no functional purpose. They still showed concern when one of their number was injured during training exercises, gathering around wounded comrades in ways that suggested emotional attachment rather than simple tactical assessment. These behaviors were inefficient and would likely be suppressed by their psychosurgical modifications over time, but watching them made me aware of how much I had lost, how completely my own humanity had been stripped away by years of service and extensive augmentation. I tried to access that core of self that had once been Thaddeus Crane, tried to find some remnant of the person who had volunteered for the Skitarii, with hope and fear mixing in equal measure, but I found only distant echoes, memories that felt like they belonged to someone else, someone who had died long ago and whose designation I now carried. Our deployment orders came 6 weeks after I began training Delta 3. instructions transmitted directly to my enhanced data tether that tasked us with supporting Skitarii operations on Forge World Metallica, one of the Cult Mechanicus's most important installations that was currently under siege by Chaos forces. Metallica was particularly associated with radium technology, having cleansed their Forge world of all natural biological life through decades of industrial processes and weapons testing, and the Skitarii Vanguard cohort stationed there permanently operated in what the briefing materials described as a deadly fog of radiation that hung around them constantly. This made Metallica an ideal environment for Vanguard operations, the entire planet already so contaminated that our additional radioactivity would barely register against the background levels, and it also meant that the defenders had extensive experience with rad warfare and would coordinate effectively with our maniple. The enemy forces consisted primarily of Chaos cultists and traitor Astartes from the Death Guard Legion, followers of the plague god Nurgle, whose corrupted flesh was resistant to conventional weapons and whose supernatural resilience allowed them to continue fighting despite injuries that would kill normal humans instantly. But radiation worked differently than conventional weapons, the briefing materials noted. It affected targets at the molecular level, regardless of their supernatural durability or demonic corruption, and Vanguard cohorts had demonstrated unusual effectiveness against Death Guard forces in previous engagements. This deployment would test whether that effectiveness could be replicated at scale, whether concentrated Vanguard operations could turn the tide against Chaos forces that had proven nearly impossible to dislodge through standard military action. The journey to Metallica aboard the Arch Mechanicus gave me time to prepare Delta 3 for the specific challenges they would face, fighting against Chaos forces, challenges that differed significantly from the straightforward combat we had experienced against Tyrannid swarms on Vordrax Prime. Chaos enemies were intelligent and tactical, capable of adapting their strategies based on battlefield conditions, and they often employed reality-warping powers drawn from the Imperium that could disrupt our augmetic systems and neurosync networks. The Death Guard, in particular, were known for their resilience, their bodies so corrupted by Nurgle's plagues that they felt no pain and could continue fighting even after sustaining damage that should be immediately fatal. Our advantage against such enemies, I explained to Delta 3, was that radiation poisoning did not care about pain tolerance or supernatural resilience. It simply corrupted organic tissue at the molecular level until that tissue could no longer function, regardless of whatever dark blessings might be sustaining it. The key to defeating Death Guard forces would be saturation, filling entire combat zones with enough radiation that even their plague-enhanced bodies would succumb, creating environmental conditions so toxic that simply existing in the affected areas would be fatal. This meant accepting even higher radiation exposure than normal Vanguard operations entailed, I told them. It meant operating in conditions that would push our contamination levels to critical thresholds much faster than standard deployments, and it meant that many of us would not survive long enough to require rad cleansing because our bodies would simply fail under the accumulated radiation load. I transmitted survival statistics from previous engagements against Death Guard forces, showing that Vanguard casualty rates in such operations typically exceeded 80%. And I watched their reactions through our shared neurosync network, feeling the fear that they could not quite suppress, mixing with the grim determination that their modifications had instilled. They would serve, they transmitted back to me, until transcendence or dissolution both were service, and I recognized my own words reflected back at me by warriors who had accepted their fate with the same emotionless dedication that I had learned over years of combat operations. The Metallica campaign began with our dropships descending through a toxic atmosphere that would have killed unaugmented humans within minutes of exposure, the air so saturated with industrial pollutants and radioactive particles that even my advanced rebreathers struggled to filter it effectively. The Forge world's surface was a nightmare of towering manufactorums and kilometer-deep mine shafts, of radiation-soaked wastelands where nothing had lived for millennia, of processing plants that belched toxic clouds thick enough to block out the planet's sun. The Death Guard had established strongholds in the Rust Quarter, a section of abandoned industrial facilities that had been condemned as too contaminated for even Skitarii operations, and they were using these positions to launch raids against more vital installations that the cult Mechanicus could not afford to lose. Our mission was to drive them out, to reclaim the Rust Quarter through the same contamination warfare that had made it uninhabitable in the first place, to demonstrate that the Adeptus Mechanicus controlled domains of poison and decay more effectively than any followers of the Plague God could manage. We advanced through the rust-choked streets in perfect formation, Delta 3 moving with the precision that months of training had instilled, our radium carbines raised and ready, our augmetic senses scanning for targets in the toxic fog that reduced visibility to a few meters. The first Death Guard we encountered were Plague Marines, traitor Astartes whose power armor was corroded and broken, whose exposed flesh was covered in suppurating sores and unnatural growths, but who moved with the terrible strength and resilience that made them among the most dangerous enemies the Imperium faced. We opened fire simultaneously, our radium carbines filling the air with hyper-irradiated ammunition, and I watched as the Plague Marines absorbed hits that should have dropped them immediately, but barely slowed their advance. Their corrupted flesh knitted together almost as fast as our bullets tore it apart, their supernatural resilience allowing them to shrug off damage that would have obliterated normal humans, and they closed the distance between us with horrifying speed. But then the radiation began to take effect. Not immediately like it did with unaugmented enemies, but gradually, accumulating in their tissues faster than even their dark blessings could repair. I saw one Plague Marine stumble mid-step, his power armor's servo motors locking up as the radiation corrupted the organic components that interfaced with his nervous system. Another dropped his weapon as his hands literally dissolved, the flesh sloughing off his bones in chunks, his Nurgle granted regeneration unable to keep pace with molecular-level destruction. A third began vomiting a black toxic sludge, his corrupted internal organs failing as the cellular damage reached critical levels. They were dying, slowly but inevitably, and there was nothing they could do to prevent it. No amount of demonic corruption or plague god blessings could save them from the fundamental physics of radiation poisoning. We continued our advance, stepping over and around the dying Plague Marines, and behind us we left a contaminated zone where even the Death Guard's supernatural resilience would not save them from the toxicity we had created. The fighting in the Rust Quarter continued for weeks, brutal close quarters. Combat in industrial facilities that provided countless positions for ambush and defense, and Delta 3 fought with dedication that would have been admirable if we had still possessed the capacity to admire anything. They followed my commands without hesitation, positioning themselves precisely where the tactical network indicated they were needed, coordinating their fire to create maximum radioactive saturation, accepting casualties without breaking formation or questioning orders. Vanguard Delta 305, the one who had asked about how long we had, died in the third week when a Plague Marine's bolter round punched through his chest plate and detonated inside his torso, the explosion scattering contaminated flesh and metal fragments across his squad mates. His death registered in our neurosync network as a simple disconnection, one node in our tactical web going dark, and we adapted our formation to compensate without pausing in our advance. 3 more members of Delta. 3 died in similar fashion over the following weeks, their designations noted for reassignment to new recruits once the campaign concluded, their bodies recovered for whatever components might be recycled and reused. By the time we successfully drove the Death Guard out of the Rust Quarter, establishing control over contaminated territory that the cult Mechanicus would likely never actually use, Only 4 members of Delta 3 remained functional, and all of them showed signs of critical radiation exposure that would require immediate intervention to prevent total system failure. I had led them effectively, achieved our mission objectives with acceptable losses, demonstrated the tactical proficiency expected of a Vanguard Alpha. But when I looked at the surviving members of my maniple, I felt something that my psychosurgical modifications could not completely suppress, a shadow of what might have been guilt or regret at having consumed their lives in service to objectives that seemed increasingly meaningless. The rad cleansing after the Metallica campaign was my second such procedure, and the tech priests informed me that I was approaching the limits of how many times my organic components could survive the cleansing process. My flesh was too damaged, too thoroughly contaminated, to regenerate properly anymore, and the next time my radiation levels reached critical thresholds, they would need to replace more of my remaining organic material with cybernetic alternatives, or accept that I had reached the end of my service life. The cleansing itself was, if anything, more agonizing than the first time, my body having less capacity to heal and more extensively damaged tissue to purge. And when I emerged from the chamber, I was more machine than I had been before. Patches of my skin simply failing to regenerate and leaving bare metal visible. The tech priests noted these failures in their reports with clinical precision, marking me as a candidate for Alpha Primus status, pending further augmentation, and they began planning the procedures that would replace my remaining organs and convert me into the kind of heavily modified commander who could operate independently for years without maintenance. I accepted this recommendation because there was no logical reason to decline, because continued service was the only purpose my existence held, because refusing would mean death without meaning or value. But in the quiet moments between missions, in the rare periods when I was not processing tactical data or coordinating maniple operations or undergoing medical procedures, I found myself reviewing the memories of Thaddeus Crane with something that might have been nostalgia if I still possessed the full capacity for such emotions. I remembered the boy who had volunteered for the Skitarii, hoping to escape the death that claimed all workers in the sorting facilities. I remembered the fear and hope that had mixed in his chest as he was selected for augmentation. I remembered his belief that becoming something more than human would save him from the fate his parents had suffered. He had been wrong about everything. The augmentation had not saved him. It had simply changed the manner of his death, traded quick oblivion in the sorting facilities for a slow dissolution measured in combat deployments and rad cleansing cycles. He had not become something more than human. He had become something less than human, a collection of mechanical components wrapped around fragmenting consciousness that could barely remember what it meant to be alive. He had not escaped his parents' fate. He had simply taken longer to arrive at the same destination, his body slowly destroyed by radiation just as theirs had been, the only difference being that the cult mechanicus had extracted decades of service from his corpse before allowing it to finally stop functioning. I wanted to tell him that his choice had been wrong, that he should have accepted death in the sorting facilities rather than volunteering for transformation into a weapon that killed everything it touched, including itself. But I no longer possessed the capacity for such communication across time, and even if I had, I could not imagine what comfort such a message would provide. The path he had chosen was the only path available to him, the only alternative to dying young and forgotten, and while it had led to suffering and dissolution, it had also led to something that the cult mechanicus would call meaningful service, and that I could no longer evaluate with sufficient emotional clarity to judge one way or another. The missions continued, deployment after deployment to hostile worlds, where Vanguard cohorts were needed to cleanse zones too contaminated for normal forces or to fight enemies too resilient for conventional weapons. I led multiple maniples over the following years, though my perception of time had become increasingly distorted by the combination of extended deployments and the way my augmented brain processed temporal information. New recruits would arrive. I would train them according to established protocols. I would lead them into combat, where most of them would die, and the survivors would be recycled back through rad cleansing and reassigned, and then the cycle would repeat with new designations and the same terrified augmetic eyes looking at me for guidance I could no longer meaningfully provide. The physical degradation continued despite increasingly aggressive medical interventions, my remaining organic tissue breaking down faster than the tech priests had predicted, my body accumulating radiation to levels that registered as hazardous on detection equipment from meters away. The ground did begin to become barren in my footsteps, plants withering and dying after I passed, soil turning toxic from my mere presence, and I understood then that I had achieved the state described in the Vanguard briefings, the condition where a warrior had become so contaminated that they were a walking death zone. This was presented as an achievement, a sign of dedication and service, but it felt like confirmation that I had stopped being anything recognizable as alive and had become instead a moving source of poison, a weapon that the cult Mechanicus deployed against its enemies, but that would inevitably contaminate everything it encountered. The final augmentation procedures came after my 5th rad cleansing attempt, when the tech priests determined that my organic components had degraded beyond the point where cleansing remained viable, and that I would require extensive cybernetic replacement to continue functioning. They stripped away my remaining organs systematically, my heart and lungs and digestive system all replaced with mechanical equivalents that would not fail under radiation exposure. My skeletal structure reinforced with titanium frameworks that could bear loads. My calcium-depleted bones could no longer support. My nervous system supplemented with additional cogitators that took over processing functions my damaged brain could no longer perform reliably. The procedures took months, the tech priests working in stages to ensure my consciousness remained intact throughout the transformation, and when they finally declared the augmentation complete, I'd passed beyond the Crux Mechanicus into Alpha Primus status. I was now approximately 95% machine by volume, my remaining organic components limited to portions of my brain that the cult Mechanicus had not yet learned to successfully replicate, and sections of nervous tissue that were necessary for maintaining some baseline level of consciousness. I could operate independently for years without significant maintenance, they told me. I was as solid and reliable as the titanium and steel and blessed iron that had replaced my flesh. I was a perfect example of the union between human consciousness and mechanical perfection that the cult Mechanicus sought to achieve. Looking at my reflection in the polished metal surfaces of the medical bay, I saw something that might once have been human, but had been so transformed that the connection was barely recognizable. I was a machine that thought, a collection of blessed technologies assembled around a core of deteriorating biological tissue, and while my augmented brain processed this transformation as successful and beneficial, that final fragmenting echo of Thaddeus Crane felt something that transcended the psychosurgical modifications that should have prevented all emotional response, a horror so profound that it penetrated even the dampening systems in my skull. My final deployment came years after my elevation to Alpha Primus status, a solo reconnaissance mission to a contested world where Vanguard forces had operated decades earlier, and where the tech priests wanted updated data on the long-term effects of radiation warfare. They sent me alone because my extensive augmentation made me capable of independent operation, and because the radiation levels in the target zones were high enough that even standard Vanguard would accumulate critical exposure within hours. I descended to the planet's surface in a dropship that maintained maximum distance from the contaminated areas, its crew refusing to approach closer than necessary for my deployment, and I walked into dead zones that had been created by warriors like myself during campaigns fought before I had even volunteered for the Skitarii. The landscape was apocalyptic, bare rock and dust extending to the horizon, not a single plant or insect or microorganism surviving in soil, saturated with radioactive isotopes that would remain deadly for thousands of years. I walked through fields of skeletal remains, the bones of soldiers and civilians who had been caught in the rad storms created during the fighting, and these bones glowed faintly in the darkness, contaminated so thoroughly that they would be dangerous to handle for millennia. My augmetic sensors detected radiation levels that would kill unaugmented humans within minutes and standard vanguard within hours, but I felt nothing. My heavily modified body processing and filtering the contamination automatically, my consciousness noting the data for my report, but experiencing no emotional response to the devastation surrounding me. I found a sealed bunker in one of the dead zones, its entrance partially collapsed but still marked with faded Imperial symbols, and my augmented strength allowed me to clear the debris and access the interior. Inside were survivors from the original campaign, civilians who had sheltered during the Vanguard assault decades ago, and who had remained sealed in their refuge ever since, afraid to emerge into the contaminated wasteland outside. They were dying slowly from accumulated radiation exposure, their bodies mutated and corrupted by decades of living in spaces that had never been designed for long-term habitation, and when they saw me, they screamed, their augmetic sensors immediately recognizing what I was and understanding that I represented not salvation, but simply a different kind of death. They begged for mercy, prayed to the Emperor for deliverance from the nightmare their lives had become, and I understood that I was that deliverance, that my purpose here was not to rescue, but to cleanse, to end suffering that should have ended decades ago. I raised my radium pistol and fired, each shot precise and efficient, each death quick and painless compared to the slow radiation poisoning they had endured, and I felt nothing performing this mercy killing, no satisfaction or regret or recognition of the terrible weight of what I was doing. The action was simply necessary. It fulfilled my mission parameters. It represented the compassionate response that the Imperium could offer to those who had suffered in its service. I walked away from the collapsed bunker, my radiation signature having weakened its structure enough that it would likely collapse fully within hours, and I continued my reconnaissance, cataloging dead zones and contamination levels and the permanent scars that Vanguard operations had carved into this world. Standing on a ridge overlooking a wasteland that extended for hundreds of kilometers, I found myself processing data that my augmented brain had not been asked to analyze, thoughts that served no tactical purpose and contributed nothing to my mission objectives. I thought about Thaddeus Crane, about the boy who had volunteered for augmentation, about the Vanguard, who had fought on Vordrax Prime and Metallica, and a dozen other worlds whose names I could no longer reliably recall. I thought about the members of Theta 7 and Delta 3 and all the other maniples I had led into combat, their designations recorded in my memory banks, but their faces and personalities erased by time and modification, and the simple fact that they had never been important as individuals, only as components in the larger mechanism of Imperial warfare. I thought about the radiation that surrounded me, the contamination that leaked from my pack generators and the weapons I carried and my very presence, the poison that had defined my existence for years or decades, the slow death that I had been dying since the moment I accepted my first radium carbine. I was Vanguard Alpha Primus Theta 773, candidate for further promotion if I survived long enough, blessed servant of the Omnissiah who had sacrificed everything mortal and human in pursuit of perfect mechanical function, walking death who contaminated everything I touched and left barren wastelands in my wake. I was sacred instrument and martyr, weapon and warning, the end result of a process that had transformed Thaddeus Crane from a frightened boy into something that could no longer be meaningfully described as alive. The flesh was weak, The cult mechanicus taught, the flesh was gone, replaced by blessed machinery that would serve until its components finally failed and I was recycled into new forms of service. Only the machine remained, only the radiation endured, only service was eternal, and this was all I was, all I had ever become, all I would be until the moment when even my augmented systems could no longer continue, and I returned to the sacred oils. This is the horrible life of a Skitarii vanguard, this transformation from human to weapon, this slow dissolution measured in combat deployments and rad cleansing cycles, this existence where death comes not as release, but as the inevitable conclusion of a process that began with hope and ended with horror. This is my blessing, the gift of the Omnissiah that allowed me to serve beyond the limits of mortal flesh. This is my curse, the knowledge that accompanies consciousness even when that consciousness has been modified and suppressed and restructured into something barely recognizable as human thought. This is all I am, a collection of blessed technologies wrapped around fragmenting biological tissue. A weapon that kills everything including itself. A soldier who has forgotten what he was fighting for, but continues to fight because his modified brain cannot conceive of any alternative. This is all I will ever be, not because I chose this fate, but because the choice I made as a frightened boy in the sorting facilities on Mars led inevitably to this moment, to this recognition, to this standing on the edge of a dead world and an understanding that I am both the cause and the consequence of the destruction that surrounds me. The horrible life continues without end, until even the blessed machinery fails and service concludes. And somewhere in the deepest recess of my modified consciousness, in that last fragmenting echo of Thaddeus Crane, I wonder if death will bring peace or simply oblivion, release or just another form of recycling, and I find that I no longer possess the capacity to care which it will be.